Welcome back, YouTube. So this is for my subscribers that I still retain right now. Obviously, this channel has been kind of abandoned at this point, but I'm still active within some of the answers and questions that individuals may send out to me. So I need to address something that is specific to the Chrysler small block cylinder head family. Many misinformation is being shared because it's just it's something that the factory did, and it's not necessarily something they promoted or documented within their catalogs or within Mopar Performance Direct Connection, so on and so forth. We're getting that in just a minute, but yesterday and today, karma is showing its face once again. What areas of the country are experiencing tornado damage? So whether it be flooding, tornado damages, or inclement weather, it's fairly certain that I believe karma is kind of working for me. So anybody that kind of stood out and took a negative impact towards it, what are you guys going to learn? Okay. Now with that, we're going to get into it. The small block Chrysler cylinder head family, whether it's the 273, 318, 340, or 360, they all use cylinder heads that were fairly similar in makeup, with a few exceptions. When you see the casting ladder on the outside of the cylinder head, either XJ or U casting, you can't necessarily believe that that is what's underneath the valve cover. Even if you take off the valve cover and you see the casting number of 915 as the last three digits, that still doesn't tell you exactly what casting you have, because they use those identifying marks for all of the cylinder heads. Okay, so all of the 915 cylinder heads, they're not all the same. All the X heads, they're not all the same. All the J heads, they're not all the same. And one of the things that made them different was what year they were actually produced and who they were supplied to. Now, specifically, more of the TA cylinder heads is what's going to make them a little bit different. The TA cylinder heads, right from the casting forms themselves, have the pushrod guide hole moved away from the intake port itself. So when you talk, many guys out there will think, oh, okay, the pinch, you have to worry about the pinch, and it's always created by the casting of the cylinder head between the pushrod and the actual intake port. The TA cylinder heads, they used an offset rocker. We'll be getting in the stamping and also the cast iron adjustable valve trains in just a moment. But by moving the actual push rod to the side, they could leave some of the casting there and drill or cast the whole passage for the push rod away from the pinch point. That is not the only difference between the cylinder heads. Some of the 1967 through 1969 cylinder head years, they also had different exhausts. So all of you are familiar with the difference between your LA and your Magnum cylinder head exhaust configuration, whether it's a smog head, so on and so forth. And you're all aware of the different combustion chambers used within that. So even within the XJ and U family, you could either have open chambers or closed. Majority of the time, the J cylinder heads and the X cylinder heads were an open combustion chamber. But it's not always the case, because once again, having these identifying marks does not guarantee what's actually on the inside. In 1967 through 1969, when the 340 was being introduced, the only platform that was out there so far at that point was the 273, except for individual racing teams. Now, for you, some of you NASCAR fans, you obviously know who Richard Petty is. Richard Petty made the attempt to actually get into drag racing. And then the very first year he had a major wreck to the point where it almost killed him. Richard Petty was a factory direct, high performance component team. So Chrysler would give them, as a team, components that were not exactly the same as what they put on their average cars. If you were also part of the Trans Am series, now we're not talking just the TA definition or ID markings on the vehicles. If you were part of the Trans Am series from 1969 through 1973, you also received these same kind of factory direct performance parts, but they would carry the designation of a J or a 915 or an X cylinder head, even though they had the TA offset pushrod hole and also a different configuration within the exhaust. So for any of you guys that have tried porting the exhaust of the LA cylinder heads, you'll notice that the hump for the valve guide is fairly narrow. Okay, so you can't necessarily port through them because you'll get into the water jacket. But the cylinder head supplied to the Trans Am teams, mainly those being used for the Mark Donohue Racing Series, or teams I should say, they received a special modified X cylinder head that had the TA offset rockers, moving that pinch out, allowing the intake ports to be fairly bigger, and it also pushed that casting of the exhaust port, the roof, back approximately 1/2 of an inch, and the casting was thicker around the exhaust ports. Now, in order to abide by the regulations of these racing syndicates, the parts had to carry factory part numbers. Pure stock racing, whether it be drag racing or within Circle Track, a inspector could lift the valve cover or see the designation on the outside of the cylinder head, but that was not what was actually inside the makeup of the cylinder head. So there was two genera of cylinder heads that were specifically given to the race teams. And in order to qualify, again, according to the regulations, they had to make so many of them in production to qualify as a stock component. They used the casting numbers or letters, so from the outside they would pass inspection. But unless you actually took the cylinder head off or the valve cover off, you could tell if it was a TA immediately from taking the valve cover off. You had to take the exhaust off and look actually inside the port to see if you got the performance variation of the X head that was specifically for Trans Am, and you have to take the cylinder head off to see if you actually have the closed chamber. Now, some of the later castings, the mid-1980s castings, they had the kidney-shaped combustion chambers. Realizing that the performance cylinder heads with either X, J, or U castings, letters on the outside, and the 915 part number, they did come with a closed chamber, similar to the big block Chrysler combustion chamber, where the quench side of the chamber was filled in. It didn't have that kidney shape, it had that half D-shaped combustion chamber. Now, in 1969, when the 340 was used for Trans Am series, it was obviously a D-stroke combination, because at that point they were allowing up to 305 cubic inch engines. Now, that was not the first time that casting made it into performance use of race teams. In 1967, the 305 cubic inch engine used in NASCAR within the number 22 race team, they also received the closed chamber, the big block Chrysler D-shaped combustion chamber, the TA offset rockers, and also the deeper exhaust ports. Okay, the gasket face of both the intake and exhaust were exactly the same as some of the other combinations, but it was actually the casting inside of the ports that was different. In 1970, the Mark Donohue Racing Team received the contract to those modified cylinder heads. In 1969 and 1970, the castings from the factory had the rocker shaft pedestals removed. Okay, there was no such thing as that actually coming cast into them. They were removed in the original casting. It wasn't something that they had to machine down later on. Those forms did not include the pedestals at all. They were just a flat pad that had to be machined within the final inspection, and it was left up to the racing teams, their machinist, to gather the height of that pad that was remaining left over. Now, I just received a question. Somebody had sent me some photos online of a cylinder head they had, and they knew it was some kind of a TA head, but they didn't know exactly what year. In 1971 through 1973, the TA variations of automobiles produced for the manufacturers for street use, not racing teams, they were equipped with the TA cylinder heads with the full-length rocker shaft pedestals. But at that time, again, some of these numbers that were given to the race teams, the average person couldn't get a hold of them. But if they had the access to a 1970 through 73 Challenger or AAR CUDA, they were equipped with that tall pedestal, the full-length pedestal cylinder head. But you didn't know what combustion chamber they had. Okay? Majority of the factory ones came with a open combustion chamber. They also included the pedestal, but you also had to use the offset rockers. Now, as early as 1967, on the NASCAR variation of cylinder head, they used the offset TA pushrod location. From 1967 to 1969, they used the cast iron adjustable valve train rockers. It wasn't until 1971 through 1973 that the TA abbreviated cars that use the TA cylinder heads use the stamp rockers. They will not work with a traditional LA cylinder head. Okay, so it is rare to find these type of cylinder heads in this variation because, once again, they were only provided directly to factory racers. Those under contract with Mopar at the time, or with Chrysler at the time, to use those cylinder heads only in race circumstances. And in order to comply to regulations, they only made the bare minimum number to qualify as a mass-produced piece. 500 copies or 500 cylinder heads were created within these different high-performance variations only supplied to the race teams. So when you're out looking for a set of cylinder heads, be aware that from 1967 to 1973, you can't just look at the casting number or the stamping to determine what the cylinder head is. You actually have to look on the inside. The most obvious one is you're going to be able to tell the offset rockers, whether it be cast iron or stamped, if it's a TA cylinder head valve train. But again, going back to the Trans Am, the Mark Donohue teams or the other Chrysler teams that were racing at the time from 1970 to 73, they received cylinder heads that had deeper exhaust ports, the offset either cast iron or stamped steel rockers, also with the pads, the pedestals, the rocker shaft pedestals removed in the original castings. There was only 500 produced. Between 1967's NASCAR and Trans Am series, majority of those cylinder heads were destroyed. Okay, obviously with high RPMs or the use within the race teams, they didn't find their way into the general public to be used as a swap or a high performance piece. It took me almost 30 years to find two usable castings of the X cylinder head. They had all of the high performance options included from Mopar. Prior to that, I was running a J cylinder head that came from the 1970 AAR CUDA. Now again, in 1970 to 73, they had the taller pedestals. But when you ordered directly from Mopar Connection, the TA racing valve train components, they came with the blocks that didn't use the pedestals. You had to get them machined. Okay, so there are some subtle differences that occurred from 1967 to 1973. The only telltale way to tell the difference between the NASCAR and the Trans Am variations of performance cylinder heads is within the exhaust. Only the Trans Am cylinder heads used from late 1969 through 1973, specifically for the Trans Am Racing Series, came with a deeper exhaust. The 1967 through 1973 cylinder heads for both NASCAR and TA had a closed combustion chamber, exactly like the big block Chryslers do, the D shape. It wasn't until the 1980s, approximately 1985, with the Dodge Diplomats or the Police Interceptors, that they came out with the 802 kidney-shaped combustion chamber. So hopefully that answers a few questions. Again, every manufacturer, as I've been doing this, every manufacturer has done something similar to that. Racing teams will receive parts that were underneath a part number within a general catalog to prove to the inspectors that they're a mass-produced number to qualify for the regulations. But inside, they could have been completely different. Chevy was very well known for doing that in the late 1980s through approximately 1992 within some of their fast burn cylinder heads, whether it be the cast iron or aluminum variations. Just by lifting the valve cover off, looking at the number would not tell you exactly which cylinder head you were getting. You couldn't tell necessarily within the chassis of the car of which cylinder heads you're getting, because they gave different ones to the Monte Carlos, the Camaros, Corvettes. They all had a different variation, even though the casting numbers may have been the same. So again, just be aware of that. Ford is probably the most consistent as far as what their casting number was on the cylinder head to what it actually was. Okay. Again, going back to the 1960s, Ford, with all the different FE and 385 series cylinder heads, they have thrown in different combinations there. And they also supplied different cylinder heads through the 1980s to their race teams that were not specific to the part number or the manufacturer. Okay, so even your 385 series racing cylinder heads from Ford may have been completely different than the part number that they shared with the inspectors. Racing teams receive specific castings, separate from what you could buy over the counter through a performance catalog, so on and so forth. In order to find these type of heads that were either NASCAR or Trans Am, they're getting even more rare. In 30 years, I'm the only one that has 2 castings of the X head that came from the Trans Am series. Of all the different shows or swap meets that I've gone to, being involved with multiple different engine shops across the country, I'm the only one that owns a pair of those heads that I'm aware of. Okay, they might exist somewhere, but out of the 500, I have 2 of them. Now, another thing that was done, obviously, from 1967 through 1973 was the cubic inch limit. That 302 to 305 cubic inch limit that was controlled by the Trans Am series, they were all 340 blocks. All of them. So the closed chambered modified cylinder head that was created from 1967 through 1973, equipped on a 340 block with a bigger bore, achieved approximately 10.5 to 1 compression with a flat top piston. So even the pistons during 1967 through 1973 were designed directly out of the mold to be equipped on those race engines for those race teams and suffice and qualify for the 10.5 inch or 10.5 cubic inch compression limit within those series. NASCAR was allowed to go a little bit higher than that, but it wasn't from a dome piston. It was from actually machining the blocks and the cylinder heads to close the CC combustion chamber of the cylinder head to achieve the higher compression. So just an updated video. You have to be specific of what you get because cylinder heads can change depending on where they were cast. Here's a good example for more of your modern day engine builders. For some of you that were using the Engine Quest cylinder heads, the first generation were much better than the most recent variation. Over the last 25 years, depending on where those cylinder heads were cast, there could be small differences within the cylinder heads, but they carried the exact same part number or casting stamp. How does an inspector at a racetrack look at the cylinder heads and be like, "Yep, those are fine. They're compatible to our rules"? Every one of the cylinder head manufacturers in the late 1990s through approximately 2008, 2010, they all had a variation that was higher performance than what the catalog part numbers provided. World Products, Dart, Proline, another one, Patriot, they all offered a cylinder head in their initial factory castings that was a better performance piece than what ended up being sold through Summit, Jigs, or the parts catalogs. If you ordered direct, they had a much better variation. Even those guys that are following with Brodix and AFR to this day, Brodix created a cylinder head for Jesse James for the big block that was light years ahead of its time. It is now the casting they are using for their traditional B series cylinder heads. So depending on when you bought them or when they were manufactured, you can determine if it was actually a more high performance piece. So you have to be aware of the subtle differences between all of the cylinder heads to verify if they were actually a factory supplied piece or if they were a high performance factory direct race team cylinder head. You can't go by the casting numbers or the stamping 100% of the time to determine what you have. You have to look at the subtle details within the cylinder heads. Hopefully that helps out. If you find a set of cylinder heads in a swap meet, again, don't necessarily just look at the numbers or the stamping. Look at the actual details. Look at the combustion chamber. Look at the size of the valves. Look at the offset of the push rod guide hole. Look at how deep the exhaust ports are. The Trans Am Series X cylinder heads, the two that I have, the exhaust ports are 40 cc's bigger than the standard small block Chrysler LA cylinder port. They're larger. They have the same shape as the more modern day Magnum, but much larger in volume. Okay, now there was also other things offered that came with those cylinder heads specific to the race teams. There are parts that you could not buy over the counter through your direct connection or Mopar dealer. They had to be parts supplied directly to the race teams from Chrysler, Dodge, or Plymouth. If you're still watching some of the Nostalgia Trans Am Series racing today, you'll have to excuse me, I can't think of the racer, but the lime green Challenger that's out there, he is running the more modern or the more factory design of the J360 head on a 340 block for Trans Am. He's approximately 50 horsepower lower than what the car was back in 1969 through 73. That's a drastic difference. Okay? That same thing refers to other auto manufacturers, especially when it comes to Trans Am. Mark Donohue obviously didn't only drive for Chrysler, he also drove for AMC. Some of the AMC Javelin teams that were out there, or AMC AMX teams that were out there, they're also supplied with engines that did not match anything that you could get in the general public. But they would carry the casting numbers to satisfy the inspectors to say that's a mass-produced engine in the stock series. They're not even close. Okay, so with that, that's why it pays to take time to learn the history of all the manufacturers, when things were produced, where it was produced, because it was only out of certain locations that the performance models were actually produced. With that, enjoy those tornadoes and flooding, guys. Have a good one.